Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My wife and I bought our house about 2 years ago. It's nothing fancy, but it's got a decent yard for our three boys to play in, and we've made it our home. The neighborhood is mostly quiet, except for this one guy who lives across the field and across the street from us. From day one, something seemed off about him. 5 days ago, we were in our bedroom when I happened to look out the window and saw the neighbor deliberately trying to run over a dog with his car. I muttered to my wife about how crazy that was, but then went on with my day. I mean, what could I do? I wasn't even sure if I had seen it right. But the next day, there was no mistaking what we saw. From our window, we watched as he grabbed his adult pit bull by the neck and dragged the poor thing inside while kicking a baby blue heeler puppy off his porch. The situation escalated 3 days ago. My wife and I were out back having a smoke while our boys played in the front yard. We weren't really paying attention to anything but our phones when suddenly we heard all this yelling. I looked up to see the neighbor across the way coming out of his house, kicking his pit bull out the door and screaming at it. Then out came the blue heeler puppy, also getting kicked. All the commotion made us look over, and apparently that was enough to set him off. The neighbor started threatening me, saying he would come over and knock my head in if I kept staring at him. I just shrugged. Whatever. Everyone in Texas has a gun on the other side of every door in their house that doesn't have kids. Mine's safely locked away with thumbprint access, but I can get to it fast if needed. I wasn't worried about his threats. He went back inside and we decided to smoke another cigarette just because we weren't going to be intimidated. When my wife finished hers, she went back inside. I finished mine too, got up, opened my door, and just stood there looking at his house from across my field for about a minute. That really set him off. He came flying down his porch and to the edge of his yard. The neighbor started screaming even louder threats this time, saying he would kill me and questioning why I thought I could just stand there staring. He kept saying he would end me. He kept yelling threats but never left his yard. I just stood there watching with a big grin on my face. Eventually he must have gotten bored because he went back to what I can only imagine is his tormented shell of a life and disappeared inside. Today I went to work like usual but only had a half day since it's freezing outside, about 25 degrees. While I was at work, my wife messaged me that the crazy neighbor had tried to run over the puppy again when he got home. Now we have this habit of giving our leftover food scraps to the stray dogs during the colder days and months. It helps them, and we don't waste food. The blue heeler puppy had been smelling the food and coming over to help himself. When I got home from my half day, I saw the puppy walking across the field, probably looking for food. Instead of going in through my back door like I usually do, I walked around the house and quietly called for the puppy over my shoulder as I headed to the front door. I gently called to the puppy, telling him it was okay to come closer. Slowly, he followed me. I kept calling for him quietly as I circled my house, and he followed at a distance. He was clearly scared and wouldn't let me pet him at first. When he finally did let me touch him, he was all wet and nearly frozen. I scooped him up and brought him inside. My wife asked me what I was doing with the dog, showing surprise at my actions. I explained that I couldn't leave him outside because the crazy neighbor was trying to run him over again. My wife hesitantly responded that we couldn't just keep the dog. The boys came running when they heard us talking. My oldest son got excited and asked if we could keep the puppy. My middle son started pleading repeatedly to keep the dog. My youngest just commented on how cute the puppy was. My wife tried to explain to the boys that it wasn't simple, suggesting the dog might belong to someone. I said the dog belonged to the neighbor who was abusing him, and I refused to send him back there. The puppy was shivering, and my youngest brought a towel to wrap him in. As I dried him off, the puppy started to relax a little. My wife acknowledged that the puppy looked in bad shape and expressed concern about how the neighbor was treating him. I agreed, stating that no animal deserves such treatment. The boys were already taking turns petting him gently, and I could see my wife's resolve weakening. She asked what we would even call him, showing she was starting to accept the idea of keeping him. And that's when I knew we had a new family member. The boys started shouting out name suggestions, but my wife was watching how the puppy was gently nibbling on the corner of the towel. My wife decided his name would be Nibbler, and just like that, Nibbler found his forever home. He's already settling in nicely, following the boys around and sleeping at the foot of our bed. As for the neighbor, I'm going to be making a call to animal control about that pit bull. No animal should live in fear, and now at least one of them doesn't have to anymore. So I work nighttime security at a college dorm village. It's mostly a welfare job, making sure drunk students get home safely and helping them when they're in trouble. When we're on patrol, we wear pretty obvious uniforms: high visibility jacket, chest-mounted radio, ID badge, the whole deal. We look so official that people sometimes mistake us for police. I've been doing this job for about 2 years now. I took it because the hours worked well with my class schedule. I'm actually finishing up my master's degree in criminal justice. Ironically, I want to work in drug enforcement someday, which makes what happened last weekend even more ridiculous. Our dorm village has one main road access, and since all the nightclubs in town close at the same time, we usually hang around the taxi area to make sure students make it back to their rooms okay. We deal with all sorts of situations: students who can't pay for their taxis, lost phones, people too drunk to find their rooms, you name it. This particular Saturday night was pretty standard. It was about 2 a.m. and the clubs had just closed. I was standing near the entrance when I noticed someone walking into the village. This wasn't unusual. Some students walked back from town to save money on taxi fare. I didn't pay much attention and just continued greeting the incoming students stumbling out of taxis. A while later, I noticed the same guy coming back from deeper in the village, and he approached me directly. He casually asked me what was going on. I replied that things had quieted down and asked how he was doing. Then, without any warning, he asked if I wanted to buy some Mandy. Since he was clearly drunk or high and slurring his words, at first I wasn't sure I heard him correctly. I asked him to repeat what he'd said, and he clarified that he was selling ecstasy or MDMA. He tried to convince me by saying it was good quality and cheap. I looked down at myself, checking that I was indeed still wearing my very obvious security uniform with reflective stripes. I declined his offer, and he seemed confused. He asked why I was standing around like a creep if I wasn't interested in buying drugs. I explained that I worked there, but he didn't believe me. I had to point to my radio and ID badge as proof. When he finally realized I was security, he apologized profusely. I asked if my high visibility vest hadn't been a clue, and he admitted he thought it was just neon fashion. He nervously asked if I was going to arrest him. I explained that while I couldn't arrest him myself, I was supposed to call people who could. That's when things got even stranger. He tried to negotiate, asking what he could do to sweeten the deal. I clarified that I still didn't want his drugs, but he persisted, saying no one would know. I had to point out the camera feed, which he hadn't noticed. When I showed him the 3 CCTV cameras that had us directly in view, large, obvious security cameras mounted on poles, he complained about the surveillance state. By this point, I was just tired. It was late. I had already dealt with 2 very drunk students who had lost their room keys, and I didn't want to deal with the paperwork. I told him I couldn't be bothered with the paperwork and asked him to just go home and not come back. He thanked me profusely for letting him off. When he was leaving, he actually told me to hit him up if I ever changed my mind about buying drugs. I assured him that I wouldn't. He then gave me a thumbs up and wandered off into the night, presumably to try his sales pitch on someone else who wasn't wearing a security uniform and standing under surveillance cameras. I ended up telling my supervisor about it the next day, just in case the guy came back, and he couldn't stop laughing. He said in his 15 years working security, he'd never had someone try to sell drugs to him while he was in full uniform. Honestly, not that I've been approached by many drug dealers, but I feel like they're not usually this persistent with their hard sell. I don't know why he's in that line of business. He'd make a killing selling vacuum cleaners door to door. 2 weeks later, I saw him again. He was being escorted off campus by actual police officers. As they walked past me, he recognized me and his eyes went wide. I just shook my head and silently told him, I told you so. The look he gave was insane, equal parts embarrassment and regret. I guess he tried his sales pitch on someone who wasn't as lenient as me. I've been working as a corrections officer at our local jail for the past 14 years, and I absolutely love my job. After spending 10 years in retail hell where customers always thought they were right, working in a jail is refreshing. When an inmate gets told no, that's the end of the discussion. If they're told to do something, they're expected to follow through. No arguments, no asking for the manager. It's beautiful. My shift sergeant and I have a great working relationship. We've been working together for about 8 years now, and I've actually been at the jail 2 years longer than he has. One thing about my sergeant, he's extremely protective of his staff. Nobody messes with us without dealing with him, and that includes the inmates. Back in 2014, I had accumulated a bunch of vacation time. My wife and I decided to take a 2-week vacation to Cooperstown to visit the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame and watch the induction ceremony. Being huge Atlanta Braves fans, we had an amazing time watching Bobby Cox, Greg Maddux, and Tom Glavine get inducted. It was definitely a bucket list experience for us. When I got back to work, I jumped right back into my routine. During my rounds, I noticed an inmate approaching me who I didn't recognize. He must have been arrested while I was on vacation. This kid couldn't have been more than 20 years old, but he strutted up to me like he owned the place. The young inmate told me that he had missed yard call because he was asleep and demanded that he needed to go out to the yard right then. I explained that it was too bad and he should have woken up during the scheduled yard call for his dorm. I let him know he would have to wait until the next day's yard call. The kid looked at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. Clearly, he wasn't used to hearing the word no. He dismissed me by saying I was just a new guy and demanded to speak with my sergeant. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. This kid thought I was new. I've been working there since they put the paint on the walls, but I decided to play along. I knew my sergeant would get a kick out of this. I told him to wait right there, pointing to the exact spot where he was standing, making it clear I expected him to stay put until I returned. Then I finished my rounds and called my sergeant on the radio. I explained that I had an inmate who needed to talk to him. When Sarge asked what he wanted, I tried not to laugh as I told him about how the inmate thought I was the new guy and believed he could run over me because of it. Sarge immediately said he'd be right there. When Sarge arrived, we both went back into the dorm, but lo and behold, the inmate wasn't waiting where I told him to. This kid really didn't understand how things worked in jail. Sarge asked where the inmate was, and I admitted I didn't know. I had to raise my voice through the dorm, calling for the inmate and announcing that Sarge was here to talk to him. The kid sauntered out of his cell, still acting like he owned the place. He approached Sarge with that same entitled swagger. The inmate complained to Sarge about missing yard call and accused me, who he referred to as the new guy, of refusing to let him go out. Sarge quickly shut him down, explaining that missing yard call was his own problem, not ours, and that next time he should get himself out of bed when called. The inmate tried to interrupt Sarge to explain himself, which was a big mistake. Nobody interrupts Sarge. His voice got noticeably louder as he told the inmate that he didn't understand how things worked. Sarge made it clear that when a staff member gives an answer, that is the final answer. He also scolded the inmate for not waiting where I had told him to. The kid was still trying to save face and started to complain about the new guy again. Sarge cut him off immediately. He corrected the inmate, telling him to address me properly as officer and not the new guy. Sarge then told him that I had been working in the jail since before they even painted the walls, and that if I gave him an answer, that was definitely the final word. Sarge then ordered the inmate to go lock down. The kid looked like he'd shrunk about a foot in height. His cockiness was completely gone. When he tried to protest one more time, Sarge repeated his order to go lock down, emphasizing each word. The inmate slunk back to his cell and Sarge and I went to his office. We had a good laugh about the whole situation. Sarge wanted to lock the kid down for 3 days for disrespecting staff, but since we got such a good laugh and a good story out of it, I convinced him to make it just for the rest of the day. Later, I went back to give the inmate his lockdown paperwork. We had a talk, and it turned out he wasn't really a bad kid, just pretty clueless. He apologized for assuming I was new and for not following instructions. Since then, he's become something of a regular at our jail, not the brightest decision maker, obviously. And whenever he comes back, we still get a good laugh about the time he tried to boss around the new guy who had 14 years of experience. In this job, you learn pretty quickly that respect goes both ways. The inmates who show respect tend to have an easier time. The ones who walk in thinking they can run the place, they find out pretty quickly how wrong they are. I work for a big security company called Guards for Service in California. I was on the graveyard shift, and this wasn't my usual post. I got called in to cover for someone who couldn't make it, but apparently nobody told the supervisor I was coming. This happened back in 2019, before COVID was even a thing. It was November, peak season, and I was asked to take up a post at the Farmer Joe's distribution center in Bloomington, California. It was a graveyard shift, and coincidentally, my friend who I'd known for years had been working at this post regularly. The field manager called me on my day off and asked if I could work there for the night. I didn't mind taking the extra overtime, so I agreed. When I arrived, the shift supervisor showed me around and then left me to do my job. It was a 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. shift, a full 10 hours of fun. Everything was going fine until around 1 a.m. when the head supervisor, what the company calls a post commander, showed up. All guards are supposed to call the post commander captain, but I've always refused to call someone captain unless they actually served in the military. I was in the Farmer Joe's yard, helping truck drivers back into their gates, when I heard someone coming up behind me. Suddenly, there was yelling. The supervisor demanded to know who I was in a confrontational tone. I politely introduced myself and explained that the field manager had sent me to work this shift. She rudely responded that she had asked for someone specific, not a fat guy like me. Her comment made me angry because of how rude she was being. I told her that regardless of who she wanted, the field manager had sent me, and I was just there to do my job. She then ordered me to leave the property, claiming I was trespassing, and threatened to call the police if I didn't comply. I stood my ground and told her that I was required to stay until the end of my shift, suggesting that she could call the police, but I would be calling the field manager as well. She actually did go away and called the police on me. They showed up about 30 minutes later. When the first police officer arrived with his partner, he asked what the commotion was about. Before I could explain, the supervisor interrupted by shouting that I had threatened to kill her with a knife and was trespassing on the property. I sighed heavily as the officers looked confused, since I was clearly wearing the standard company uniform. But once they heard the word knife, the second officer immediately drew his gun and ordered me to get on the ground, with my hands behind my back. The first officer handcuffed me. Even though I was restrained, the second officer kept his gun pointed at me. I was terrified, thinking I might get shot for no reason. I did have a pocket knife on me, but it was just a small keychain knife that I used to open snack packages. The officer found the knife during his search and placed me in the back of the police car. My friend came out to see what was happening and asked the officers what was going on. When told I was being arrested for possession of a deadly weapon, threatening the supervisor, and trespassing, he defended me. He questioned what deadly weapon they were talking about and insisted that I would never threaten someone's life. He also clarified that I wasn't trespassing but had been specifically asked to work there. The officer responded that if my friend could provide evidence supporting our claims, they would release me. But until then, it remained a he said she said situation. From the police car, I asked my friend to call the field manager to come immediately and to get the building manager to pull surveillance footage, since there was a camera with audio where the confrontation happened. My friend made the call and went to find the building manager. Meanwhile, a police sergeant arrived and asked for my version of events. Soon after, the field manager arrived with our regional director, and my friend returned with the building manager. I explained that the supervisor had falsely accused me of trespassing and threatening her with a knife. The director told the officers that I had been called to work at this post at the field manager's request, When the police sergeant pointed out that this didn't explain the alleged knife threat, the building manager offered to show them the security camera footage with audio. After reviewing the footage, the police sergeant removed my handcuffs and returned my belongings. He told me that they found no evidence of threats, so all charges were being dropped. He then approached the supervisor and arrested her for lying to law enforcement, filing a false police report, and making a false emergency call. After this incident, the supervisor was taken away that night. I later attended a meeting with management, who assured me the situation had been handled and offered me the post commander position. I learned that the supervisor had been fired and banned from ever working for the security company again. I declined the position because the commute would have been too expensive. 2 weeks later, I left the company for a better paying position with a different security company much closer to home. I also decided it was time for a change. I returned to college and am now working toward a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.